The vote was already over when Marin Ashby stood up. She had been sitting still for 4 minutes while Sovereign Arbiter Dressen Volok read the delisting declaration into the record. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, to be exact, she had counted. The accreditation atrium of Varath Sable held 900 registered observers on a busy session day. Today it held 31 species delegations, every seat in the compact gallery filled, and one human delegation of 5 seated at the lowest tier of the floor. The floor tilted 3 degrees toward the hegemony's dais by design. Every visiting delegation walked slightly uphill to address them. Marin had walked that slope this morning without breaking pace, and now she sat at the bottom of it with a small brass clip warm on her left thumbnail and a bound ledger open in her lap, writing notes in longhand while her species was being formally expelled from galactic trade. That was the thing none of the 31 delegations above could parse. She was taking notes. No protest, no argument, no visible alarm. The clip was the only personal object on her. She was 54, gray at the temples, wearing a plain Terran Accord Secretariat uniform with nothing on it but her rank tab. She looked like someone who processed paperwork for a living. That was, in fact, exactly what she did, for 29 years, in offices on 3 stations and 2 planets, and for the last 11 of those years in preparation for this morning specifically. Volok concluded the second paragraph of the declaration. His voice came in clipped triple-syllable bursts, the sound of machinery changing gears, and beneath it Marin could catch the faint mineral oil scent of hegemony's ceremonial contract sealing. It was in his formal robes, applied before hearings of significance. He was 2.3 meters tall, exoskeletal ridge along the crown of his skull, 4 hands, 2 folded behind his back in the dominance posture his species used when the outcome was not in question. He had overseen 31 trade exclusions in his career. He had never had one contested. Marin turned a page in her ledger. Volok reached the 3rd paragraph. The holographic trade viability charts appeared above the center of the atrium, smooth, professional, color-coded in hegemony amber and white, built to make the outcome look like arithmetic. Humanity's conditional watchlist status had begun 28 years ago. No species had ever survived a watchlist period longer than 22 years without eventual delisting. The charts showed this clearly. They were not wrong about the data. They were wrong about what the data meant. In the compact gallery above, 31 delegations watched. Dev Marin, seated directly behind Marin, slid a folded note forward onto her desk. She did not look up. She unfolded it with one hand while writing with the other. The note read, gallery count, 31 watching, 12 already filing exit paperwork. She wrote back, tore the corner off, passed it over her shoulder. Good witnesses. Volok reached the conclusion of the declaration. He named the threshold corridor. He named the credential surrender protocol. He named the 48-hour window during which the human delegation's trade access codes would remain active for transition purposes only. Marin closed her ledger. She stood. Volok stopped. She didn't move toward the threshold corridor. She stood at the table with her hands flat on the surface, the brass clip catching the light, and she looked up the 3-degree slope at the Sovereign Arbiter and said, in a voice that did not rise, did not strain, did not ask for anything, Humanity formally invokes Article 7, subsection 14 of the Hegemony Founding Compact. We are not leaving, we are filing. The chamber went quiet in the way that only very large rooms go quiet. All at once, completely, like something had been switched off. Volok's crown ridge flushed deep amber. The part that still keeps me up at night. She hadn't even opened the archive yet. 28 years before that morning, in a sub-office of the Terran Accord Secretariat in Geneva, a man named Casper Ashby sat at a worktable covered in contract documents and hammered a single strip of brass into a small clip. He was not a craftsman. The clip was crooked on one end and too tight on the other, and it took him 3 tries to get it to sit flat on a thumbnail. But he worked on it for an hour, in the way that people sometimes work on small, useless things when they are thinking about large, serious ones. And when it was done, he held it up and looked at it, and then handed it across the worktable to his daughter. The deal isn't done when they sign it, he said. It's done when you clip it. Marin Ashby was 26 that year. She had been with the Secretariat for 3 years, long enough to know which fights were real and which were theater. The watchlist notice had arrived 6 weeks earlier, a formal document from the Pallid Hegemony declaring humanity's trade viability under conditional review. It was polite. It was thorough. It was, they both knew, the beginning of a 28-year countdown. She clipped the brass piece onto her thumbnail and didn't take it off. Her father died in GSY 3024. That was 11 years ago. He did not see this morning. He saw the first 14 years of it. He saw Marin move from contract arbitration to the Secretariat's records division, and then, quietly, into a sub-project that had no official name until she gave it one. He saw the first 300 case files assembled. He saw the first coalition contact, a Droon compact archivist who had reached out through a back channel asking a question about hegemony charter history that told Marin, without either of them saying so directly, that the Droon had noticed the same clause she had. She named the project Operation Stillwater in the spring of GSY 3013, alone in the Geneva sub-office, with the brass clip warm on her thumb and a ledger open in front of her. She wrote the first line of its mission brief in longhand. "We are not building a case to win an argument. We are building a case to end one." Verath Sable was a rotating cylinder 4 kilometers long, and the accreditation atrium occupied its central axis, the highest prestige location on the station, where the rotation was slowest and the ceiling was highest, and where 600 years of contract archives lined the inner walls in neat floor-to-ceiling stacks that no one had touched in the last 2 centuries because everything had been digitized. But the hegemony kept them there anyway. It was a deliberate choice. Walking into the atrium was supposed to make you feel small against the depth of what had already been decided. Marin had found this comforting the first time she saw it. She had been here twice before today. The first time was an orientation visit 8 years ago, when she was still officially classified as a records liaison. The second time was 11 months ago, when she had submitted a routine records request, a standard procedural document that the hegemony's clerks had processed without review, because it was routine, because it was one of several hundred routine requests they received that quarter, because there was no reason to look twice at a request from a species on the watch list. The request had been for a complete copy of the hegemony's own accreditation database, going back to GSY 2827. They had sent it in full within 3 days. On the morning of the hearing, Marin arrived an hour early. The atrium was empty except for the setup crew and a single hegemony clerk running calibration checks on the holographic display system. She walked the 3-degree floor once, from the entrance to the dais and back, at normal pace. She sat at the human delegations table and took out her ledger and wrote the first line of her opening statement in longhand, the way her father had taught her. Then she typed it. At 7:40, Ro Casson arrived. Ro was 40, a legal archivist who had been with Stillwater for 9 years, and she had a habit of eating precisely 1 salted cracker every 90 minutes during proceedings. There was a groove worn into her desk from 11 years of the same motion, the same desk she always requested, same position, same bag, same cracker. She sat, placed the cracker on the edge of the desk, and did not eat it yet. She opened the first of 4 tablet screens. She did not look at Marin. Dev Marin arrived 3 minutes later. He was 55, a data verification specialist, and he had been on Stillwater since year 4, since the 3rd year after Marin's father had introduced them at a secretariat conference and said simply, "Dev's father worked the Corvin case. He'll understand what we're doing." Dev's father had died in GSY 3019, 5 years before Marin's. Dev had not spoken above a murmur in a professional setting in 19 years. He sat, tucked a worn photograph of his 2 daughters under his tablet, and straightened it twice. The other 2 members of the delegation were Cesse Faum, a treaty registrar who handled formal document authentication, and Pel Ape, who managed archive transfer protocols and could run a cross-reference search in the time it took most people to find the right screen. Both were under 40. Both had joined Stillwater after the 7th year, when Marin had opened recruitment carefully, person by person on the basis of a single criterion. They had to understand that the point was not to win fast. The point was to win correctly, and correctly might take the rest of their careers. Neither Cesse nor Pel showed anything this morning. They sat. They waited. They had been doing this for a long time. The gallery filled above them, 31 species delegations settling into the observation tier over the course of the next 30 minutes, the quiet rustle of beings who had come to watch something rare. Trade delistings were rare. They were considered inevitable once they began, so the watching was not anxious. It was, Marin thought, the particular way that beings watch an eclipse, not afraid of it, not expecting to stop it, just present for the totality. From the gallery's 2nd tier, a figure she recognized by the bioluminescent filaments that trailed from her shoulder joints sat very still. Tethori of the Suli margin. Insectoid, 4 functional limbs in constant small adjustment, 2 vestigial limbs folded and invisible. Tethori had been on the hegemony's conditional status list for 31 years. She had filed her first formal protest against a trade ruling in GSY 3014. The hegemony had denied it in 4 minutes. She had filed 37 more protests over the following years. None had taken longer than a week to deny. She had come today because delistings were watched. She had not come for anything else, or so she believed. Marin did not look at her, not yet. Valak entered from the dais corridor at the appointed time, 8:15 exactly, with a legal attaché at his left side and 2 administrative clerks behind him. He carried nothing. That was always the signal. He needed no tools for what he was here to do. He began the declaration at 8:16. By 8:19 and 51 seconds, he had reached the credential surrender protocol. Marin's thumb pressed the brass clip once, releasing it slightly. Focus. She let it recede. She had already filed everything she needed to file. Every document was logged, cross-referenced, and time-stamped. The Droon Compact's archive copy of the Hegemony Founding Compact, original text, 600 years old, Droon certified, was in a sealed case in the hands of the Droon delegate in the Compact Gallery, who had waited 9 years for his council to authorize him to carry it to this specific room. The Suli Margin's independent mathematical verification of all 9,614 cases in the Stillwater archive had been submitted to the Hegemony's own record system 11 months ago through the same routine request protocol, processed without review. 9,614 contract violations, documented, cross-referenced, each one tagged with the Hegemony signatory who had authorized it. 408 forced compliance rulings, each one checked against the arbitration offer records. 0 arbitration offers. Not one. Not across any of the 7 historically delisted species. Not in 214 years of Hegemony accreditation authority. They had been told the clause never applied. They had never checked whether it applied. They had written it themselves in the founding year of GSY 2441, when the Hegemony's charter architects had believed, with reason, at the time, that mandatory arbitration would protect smaller species from being absorbed and stripped by larger trading blocks. The protection was real. The clause was real. And it had sat in their founding document for 600 years without anyone invoking it, because no species being delisted had ever known it was there. And the Hegemony's own archivists had long since stopped reading the founding text the way they read operational procedure. They had stopped reading their own rules. That was the sentence Marin had written in the Stillwater brief in the spring of GSY 3013 and had not changed in 28 years. They stopped reading their own rules. Valak finished the declaration and set down his formal record stylus. The Terran delegation will proceed to the threshold corridor to complete credential surrender, he said. His voice clicked through the syllables the way it always did. Machinery changing gears. The legal attaché opened a case. Marin stood. She did not close her ledger first. She placed one hand flat on the table and stood slowly, the way her father used to stand when he had finished working through a problem and was ready to present the answer. Not fast, not with ceremony, just done. She looked up the 3-degree slope. Humanity formally invokes Article 7, subsection 14 of the Hegemony Founding Compact, she said. Mandatory arbitration before any viability delisting. We are not leaving. We are filing. Valak's crown ridge flushed amber. His legal attaché stopped moving. The clerk at the holographic display looked at the clerk beside him. Neither of them spoke. No argument, no rebuttal, no exit. The atrium was quiet for 6 full seconds, long enough for 31 delegations in the gallery to register that something had happened that had not happened before in this room, and to begin, independently, to understand what it was. Valak found his voice. Article 7, subsection 14 is a procedural artifact of the founding charter. It has no operative standing in current accreditation law. That's an interpretation, Marin said. She opened her ledger to the marked page. Here is another one. She looked up. The Droon Compact delegate is present in the gallery with a physical archive copy of the founding charter, original text, Droon certified, 600 years of unbroken chain of custody. We would like it entered into the record. There was a pause. Then, from the compact gallery above, a low, deliberate sound, the movement of a dense framed being rising from a seated position. The Droon Compact's delegate descended the gallery steps with the careful arc of a species evolved in low gravity. He was carrying a sealed case the size of a large book. He set it on the evidence table without speaking and opened it. The charter text inside was handwritten. Real paper, not synthetic, the kind the Droon had been using for archival records for centuries, because synthetic degraded and real paper, stored correctly, lasted longer than most civilizations. The legal attaché was already searching records. His fingers moved fast. He found the clause. The atrium went quieter. The clause is present in the founding text, Valak said. His voice had not changed. The ridge had. It was a deeper amber now, more sustained. However, its absence from current operational procedure represents. "One moment," Marin said. She nodded to Pel Ape, who pulled up a second display beside the holographic trade charts. "This is the hegemony's own accreditation database," Marin said. "Subpoenaed 11 months ago under a routine records request. It contains the complete history of all accreditation decisions since GSY 2827, including the records for the 7 species permanently delisted in the past century. What it does not contain, in any of those 7 cases, is a record of an arbitration offer." She let that settle. "You wrote the rule," she said. "You never followed it. Those are 2 different problems, and today they are both yours." Valak's crown ridge held its amber. The legal attaché had stopped searching. He had found what he was looking for, or rather, he had found what was not there. In the gallery above, Tethori of the Suli margin had gone very still. Her 4 functional limbs, which had been in constant small adjustment since she sat down, were no longer moving. She was looking at the hegemony's accreditation database on the display below. She recognized the case format. She had filed 38 of them. Every one had been processed through this same system. She was not cheering, she was not moving. She was reading. And from the 3rd row of the gallery, 2 species away, a delegate whose species had been on conditional status for 19 years was already typing something on a private channel. Marin did not know what. She did not need to. 1016. Dev Marin's hand was flat on the table. Not resting. Flat, the particular stillness of a person who has been moving in small ways for hours and has stopped all at once. Rokassin had not eaten the cracker. It sat on the edge of her desk where she had placed it at 7:40 a.m., and she had not touched it since, and now she was writing in her ledger without looking up, without looking at the display, without looking at Valak. Only writing. The legal attaché's search had stopped returning results. Pel Ape had her hands folded. Sesai Faum was looking at the entry log on her tablet with the calm face of someone watching a number that is about to change. Valak had gone very still. In 31 years of presiding over this room, no one had ever seen Valak go still. His crown ridge was a deep, sustained amber, not the quick flush of irritation, not the brief color of procedural surprise. This was the color his species showed when they had fully assessed a situation and found no favorable path remaining. His 4 hands were at his sides, 2 visible and 2 no longer folded in the dominance posture. The posture required confidence in the outcome. He had released it. The legal attaché was typing again. The keystrokes were very loud in the quiet. Marin stood at the table and waited. She was good at waiting. She had been practicing for 28 years. Round 3 was hers to open, and she knew the exact moment for it. Not yet. Let the room hold its question one more breath. Let 31 delegations above sit with the thing they had just heard and start working through its shape. Then she nodded to Rokassin. Ro picked up the cracker, took 1 precise bite, set the remainder down, and activated the still water archive on the atrium's central display. 9,614 entries filled the air above the center of the room. Each one had a case number, a date, a hegemony signatory, a trade action category, and a status marker. The display ran the length of the holographic field, shoulder to shoulder with the hegemony's own viability charts, which were still showing humanity's trade data in amber and white. The still water archive was in no color at all. Just white text on dark, entry after entry after entry, going back 214 years. The room read it. They filed, they cataloged, they waited. From the 2nd tier of the compact gallery, Tethori of the Suli margin stood. Not fast. Her 4 functional limbs unfolded one at a time in the deliberate way of her species when they were moving with intent rather than reflex. She stood at the gallery rail and looked at the display below and her bioluminescent filaments, which had been burning a steady pale gold since she arrived, dimmed slightly. The color her species showed when something they had held at a distance had suddenly come very close. She recognized case 7,841. She recognized 7,842 and 7,843. She had filed the original protests on those 3 cases herself. In GSY 3027, after a hegemony ruling had reclassified a trade route her species had operated for 60 years as requiring new accreditation fees they could not afford. Each protest had been processed and denied. Each denial was on record in the still water archive, cross-referenced against the hegemony signatory who had authorized it, tagged with the accreditation officer who had closed the file. She had filed 38 protests across 31 years. All 38 were on that display. Marin did not look at her. Not yet. There was one more round before the moment arrived for that. The archive you are looking at? Marin said to the room and to the record, represents 28 years of documented hegemony contract violations, 9,614 cases, each one verified independently by the Sully Margins Mathematical Review Team, submitted to the hegemony's own record system 11 months ago, through standard protocol, processed and filed without objection. The hegemony has had this information for 11 months. They chose not to read it. She paused one beat. We gave them 28 years to notice. They didn't. Volak's legal attaché looked up from his search. He said something to Volak in a low tone, a single sentence, the kind that sounds like a confirmation of something already suspected. Volak's crown ridge did not change color. It was already as amber as it was going to get. The archive is extensive, Volak said. His voice was still even. He was good at even. Extensive documentation of disputed cases does not constitute grounds for. A sound from the gallery, not a voice, a movement. From the highest tier of the compact gallery, on no one's list, announced to no delegation and no court record. A figure descended the gallery steps. Elder Sova Theas of the Irony Observers was translucent-skinned, not pale, but the kind of translucent that comes from 300 years of living in low-light environments, where the faint shadows of internal structures are visible beneath the surface. She was tall, thin in the way of long-lived things, and she carried nothing except her hands, which she kept clasped in front of her in the irony gesture that meant, I am here as a witness. I have not been asked. I came anyway. The Irony Observers attended proceedings. They did not participate. Their testimony was considered unimpeachable under hegemony law, a concession the hegemony had made 3 centuries ago, when the Irony's long memory had proven more accurate than any archive the hegemony maintained. Unimpeachable meant, if an Irony said it happened, it happened. That was not a courtesy. It was written into the accreditation code. Elder Sovatheas stopped at the floor level. She looked at Volak. I have been present at 3 of the 7 historical delistings, she said. Her voice was measured, each word placed with the care of someone composing a sentence that will last longer than they will. I was present at the Korvath delisting in GSY 2934, the Melon delisting in GSY 2981, the Sethran delisting in GSY 3002. I observed all 3 proceedings in full. She paused. No arbitration was offered at any of them. I will say so under hegemony oath. I am saying so now. The legal attaché had stopped typing. Volak looked at Elder Sovatheas for a long moment. Then he looked at his attaché. The attaché gave a very small, very controlled shake of his head. There was nothing to file against irony testimony. The code didn't allow it. Marin let the silence run for 3 seconds. Then she said, quietly, the arbitration panel will require a minimum of 3 recognized species to convene. Under Article 7, any species currently in good standing with the hegemony's accreditation system may join as a panel member. She did not look at the gallery. She didn't need to. The first request came from a delegate in the 4th row, a species Marin knew had been on conditional status for 12 years. The request was filed through the atrium's formal record system, which meant it appeared on the main display alongside the still water archive. Then, a second request. Then 4 more within 90 seconds, from species Marin had never directly spoken to, species whose case files she knew by number, but whose delegates she had met only through the public record of their conditional status filings. 12 species formally requested to join the arbitration panel. They came because it was right. They stayed because she had made it useful to be right. Marin looked at Volak. We have our panel, she said. This was the moment she had planned for 11 years. Not the clause, not the archive, not even the charter. This 12 species who had been waiting their own version of 30 years, who had filed their own protests and watched them denied in 4 minutes, who had sat in this gallery or ones like it and watched other species walk the threshold corridor and understood that the same walk was eventually coming for them. She had not told them she was building this for them. She had not negotiated for their participation. She had built a legal mechanism that caught them automatically and trusted that when it did, they would understand. They had understood. Article 7 arbitration is now open, Marin said. She looked down at her ledger. She had one more thing. We will begin with GSY 2827. The room did not recognize the date immediately. Then the Droon Compact delegate, who was still standing at the evidence table with the 600-year-old charter folded in his hands, said quietly, the Korvath Confederation, the first species the hegemony ever delisted. 114 years ago, the Korvath Confederation was gone. Their civilization had collapsed within 2 generations of the delisting. The infrastructure failure cascading through trade dependency the way it always did when you removed accreditation from a species that had built its economy around hegemony access. There were no Korvath left to file a claim. There was no government, no successor state, no surviving population center large enough to hold an election. There was only their case file, which Marin had found in the hegemony's own archive. 11 months ago, in the complete database copy they had sent her within 3 days of a routine records request. The case was on record. Records in this room were law. "We are going to do this correctly," Marin said. "All of it." Valak's crown ridge had shifted. Not back to neutral, it would not go fully neutral today. But the deep amber had thinned to the pale amber of an animal that had found the edge of its territory and stopped. His 4 hands were motionless. His legal attaché had a new screen open and was writing administrative notes with the focused expression of someone documenting an outcome they did not choose. Then the gallery moved. Not applause, not cheering. Marin would remember for the rest of her life that the gallery did not cheer. What happened was quieter and harder to describe and more true. It was the particular sound of 31 species delegations, beings who had traveled from conditional status filings and denied protests and 4-minute rejections and 20-year watches, releasing something they had been holding. Just breath, just the slow, enormous exhale of a room full of people who had been gripping something for a very long time and had finally, carefully, set it down. Marin looked up at the gallery. Her eyes found Tethori of the Suli margin in the second tier. Tethori was standing very still. Her 4 functional limbs had stopped their constant small movement. And her vestigial limbs, the 2 she always kept folded tight against her body, the 2 that Suli margin delegates never extended in formal settings, the 2 that were considered a display of vulnerability in her species' social code, were extended. Slightly slowly, the involuntary way, the gesture her species made when something long held tense released all at once without warning. 31 years of conditional status. 38 denied protests. The first one denied in 4 minutes in GSY 3014 by an accreditation officer whose name was in the still water archive on the display below her feet. She looked at Marin across 40 meters of silence. Marin looked back. Neither of them spoke. The distance covered all of it. No words needed. No ceremony required. No explanation for what had happened between 2 beings who had been on opposite ends of the same system for 30 years and had just, without negotiating it, without planning it, without knowing each other's names 3 months ago, ended up in the same room at the same moment when the thing that had been wrong for a very long time was corrected. Silence, total silence. The silence of a room that has just understood something it cannot undo. Ro Cassin wrote something in her ledger and did not look up. Dev Marin tucked his daughter's photograph more firmly under his tablet. He straightened it once. The photograph was worn at the corners from being tucked and retrieved more times than he had counted. The Droon Compact delegate folded the 600-year-old charter copy with the careful respect of someone returning a thing to its place, not locking it away, just putting it back where it had always belonged, now that it had done its work. Article 7 arbitration is formally entered into record, said the Atrium's automated registry system in the flat voice that hegemony systems used for procedural confirmation. It had never said those words before. They were in its vocabulary. They had always been in its vocabulary. The system had simply never been asked to say them. Valak left without speaking. His legal attaché followed 3 steps behind. On the way out through the corridor, the attaché filed 7 administrative holds on the Atrium's record system, procedural delays, the kind that would take 3 weeks each to process. Marin watched the notifications appear on Pel Ape's screen. She picked up her pen. She added all 7 to the still water record under a new heading, post-ruling obstruction. The work was not done. It never was, but the shape of the work had changed. 6 hours after the hearing, the hegemony issued a formal statement describing the proceedings as under administrative review. The language was careful. The language was also, Marin noted, 3 times longer than their usual statements, which meant someone had spent the afternoon writing and rewriting it. By the following morning, 4 of the hegemony's 5 member species had contacted the Terran Accord Secretariat independently. Not together, not coordinated. Each one through its own back channel, using the same general framing. They were interested in preliminary arbitration consultation. Marin read all 4 messages. She forwarded them to Ro, who added them to the record and ate a cracker. The 408 conditional status suspension held for its full 180 days. During those 180 days, 22 species filed their own Article 7 invocations. They had seen it done now. They knew the mechanism existed. They knew how to use it. Marin's team provided procedural guidance to 14 of them, not advocacy, just the same patient explanation of how the clause worked that Marin had given to the arbitration panel on the morning of the hearing. One step at a time, one document at a time, correctly. The irony observers formally added the proceedings to their witnessed records, the highest form of historical certification their culture maintained. Elder Sova Thiaz composed the entry herself. It was 11 words in irony, which translated approximately as, "They arrived with paper. They left with everything still intact." Dev Marin packed the archive drives into a standard-issue case with a broken latch he had been meaning to replace for 2 years. The replacement latch was in his coat pocket. He still didn't fix it. He was sealing the last drive when he asked, quietly, without looking up, "Did you ever doubt the clause would hold?" Marin thought about that. It was a fair question. It deserved a real answer. "The clause was never the uncertainty," she said. "The uncertainty was whether we'd be patient enough to get to the room where it mattered." She paused. "Your father's cases are in the archive, cases 7 through 41 in the original still water file. He built the cross-reference method we used on everything after." Dev did not answer. He closed the case. He held it for a moment with both hands, the broken latch loose under his thumb. Then he set it on the table with the others. 8 months later, the Hegemony Founding Compact was formally amended. The arbitration clause was now mandatory, automated, and could not be waived by any accreditation officer at any level. The amendment passed through the Hegemony's own internal governance process, not by human petition, but because 4 of its 5 member species had separately concluded that operating a system for 214 years in violation of its founding document was a liability they were no longer willing to carry. 4 of the 7 historically delisted species had surviving successor governments. 2 of those 4 filed formal recognition claims. Both were accepted. The Hegemony's accreditation authority was restructured under a joint oversight body. Humanity held one of the permanent seats. The Korvath Confederation's case remained open. There was no one to receive a ruling. Marin did not close it. She marked it witnessed and recorded and let it sit in the archive where it had always been, where it would remain longer than any of them. She went to the Remembrance alcove on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the amendment passed. It was a small room in the Terran Accord Secretariat's Geneva sub-office, the same building where her father had sat at a work table and hammered a strip of brass into a clip that was too tight on one end and crooked at the other. The alcove had no windows. It had 1 shelf and 1 ledger, handwritten, never digitized, containing 61 names. The names were the people who had worked on still water and not lived to see the hearing. Her father was on the 3rd line. Dev's father was on the 9th. Rose's predecessor, the archivist who had spent 6 years building the original case numbering system before her death in GSY 3031, was on the 22nd. Marin stood in front of the shelf for a while. She reached up and unclipped the brass piece from her thumbnail. She held it for a moment, warm as it always was, the one edge worn so smooth it was almost soft now, softer than brass should be, worked down by 28 years of the same small motion. Her father's hands had shaped it rough. Her hands had shaped it smooth. She set it on the shelf. She did not put it back on. She stood in the alcove for a little while longer. The ledger sat on the shelf beside the clip. The names did not need to be read again. She knew them. She had always known them. The knowing was the whole point. That someone in a small room in Geneva, on a Tuesday with no one watching, held the count. She turned and walked out. The clip sat on the shelf in the empty alcove, warm from her hand, going slowly cool.